Thank you. Look, hey, what an honor for me to be able to stand on this stage in my home church and share God's word. It really is. It's a privilege, it's an honor, and I'm just so thankful. Who's enjoying this series? The Upside Down Kingdom. You know, Pastor Jeff has just preached two brilliant messages the past week, and this week, today, we're going to be talking about the good news of obedience from Jonah chapter 3. Did you know that obedience is good news? Just getting started and it's getting hard. You know, for many years, I was a police officer here in Gwinnett County, hence the police car. Retired in 2011 as a lieutenant, and I know you're thinking, wow, you don't look nearly old enough to be retired for that long. Well, you know, that happens when you start when you're 12. But, you know, for many years I was a police officer. And one of the jobs that I had during my career was I was a field training officer, an FTO. And what a field training officer does is you get those recruits right out of the academy. We call them baby police officers. They come out of the academy, they don't know anything, and they ride with a field training officer, usually a corporal, and there's my buddy right there, Ross Peppers, retired policeman. He was a training officer as well. And they give you this recruit, and you've got them for 2 or 3 weeks, and they ride with you, and you try and teach them something. And then they go to another field training officer. And in all, they ride with maybe 3 or 4 different officers, depending on how fast they're getting it. And then they're released on their own. Now, if you've got control issues, being a field training officer is not going to work, because you have to be willing to sit in the passenger seat sometimes and let them do the driving. That can be kind of tough. One of the recruits I had was a nice young guy. He was from New York. His name was Paul. He had come down here to take a job, and I think I was his second field training officer. We were working the night shift, actually in this area. The night shift had started off pretty good. I had a big cup of coffee in my hand. I'm strapped into the passenger seat. We're driving down Collins Hill Road, and he says, "Corporal, can we go check the parks?" And I said, well, that's a good idea. You know, the parks in Gwinnett County, most of them close at 10 o'clock. It's about 11:30 now. So I said, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's go check the parks. So we drove through Collins Hill Park over there where the ball fields and the lake are. And then we came across the street. Now, across the street from Collins Hill Park, and this is my grandson Micah's police car, by the way. He told me I could borrow it, but he did say, don't drop it, Granddaddy. So I'll try and be careful with it. But we drove across from Collins Hill Park to the aquatic center. Now, the aquatic center, when you pull in there, the swimming pool's on the left, and on the right is another parking lot. It's a 2-level parking lot, 2 tiers. It's got an upper level, and it's got a lower level. There's about an 8-foot drop-off between the two. And young Paul did exactly what I had trained him to do. When we pulled into the park, he turned his lights off. Police officers like to be sneaky, if you didn't know that. And we were going to sneak up on anybody who happened to be lurking in the park. And so we pulled into the park with our lights off, and there was plenty of ambient light for somebody who's been a policeman for 20 years. For a young recruit, his night vision wasn't quite as good yet, and I took that for granted. And we went pulling into the upper level of, did I mention it was 2 levels? There's an upper level and a lower level, and there's about an 8-foot drop-off. And Paul went riding across the top level. We're riding across. He wasn't going that fast, and I'm sipping on my coffee, just, you know, enjoying life. I can see my night vision's good. I don't see anything. There's no cars. Everything's good. And then I realized we were heading straight for the drop-off. And I said, Paul, you remember there's a drop-off. I made 2 critical assumptions. First of all, that he had good night vision, and second of all, that he remembered there was a drop-off. I was wrong on both counts. And I said, Paul, you realize there's a drop. And about that time, we hit the curb, and we went airborne. Now, when you watch Fast and Furious 14, you see the cars jump, fly, land, and drive away. It doesn't work that way. I can tell you from experience. What happens is you drop on your nose and you hang there for what seems like a lifetime, and then you drop onto the top. Because that's exactly what we did in the middle of Collins Hill Park at 11:30 at night. So now we're hanging upside down. And I'm trapped. I'm in my seatbelt. I can't get out. I'm upside down. I've got hot, warm liquid dripping down my face. I think I'm bleeding. And Paul is like, Corporal, we've got to get out of the car. And I said, well, you moron, come help me get out. I'm trapped. So he crawls around the car, gets out, comes and helps me get out. And a little known fact, if you've never been in an upside down car, the oil, because the engine's still running, the oil is pouring out of it onto the hot engine, and smoke is billowing out of the bottom of the car. And my young recruit says, Corporal, we've got to get away. The car's going to blow up. And I said, no. You're going to crawl back inside, and you're going to turn the car off. And he said, no. I said, yes, you are. Well, what if it blows up? I said, well, it will serve you right. So he crawled back in and turned the car off, and I would say everything's fine, but it wasn't. I had a broken finger from the ordeal. Young Paul almost got fired. I did go in and fall on the sword for him. I said, no, he's dumb, but it was my fault. I told him. He did exactly what I told him to do. I'm the dummy. And so we were able to keep his job. But here's the moral of the story. Don't ride with a rookie police officer. But the real moral of the story is this. At some point in your life, you are going to find yourself hanging upside down. Hopefully it's just going to be figuratively, not literally, but figuratively. Hopefully you're going to find yourself not hanging upside down in a car in the middle of the night. But listen, that's life. You are going to find yourself hanging upside down and not knowing what happened. Now, sometimes you're going to be the one who drove over the edge of that cliff. Maybe you had a friend who said, you know what, that's probably not a good relationship for you. Oh, no, it's fine. We love each other. Or somebody said, you know, that business, they've just got some shady practices. I just don't know that you want to be affiliated with them. Oh, no, it's fine. As we go over the cliff. Sometimes we're the passenger. Sometimes we're just along for the ride. And we find ourselves in that sinking feeling going through the air, realizing that we're falling. And you know, that's kind of what happened to Jonah. He was the one driving. He drove right off the edge of the cliff. God says, here's what I want you to do. He said, nope, not doing it. Not going to happen. And he went the opposite direction, and he ended up in the ocean, in the belly of a fish, upside down. Now, as Pastor Joe mentioned, and this is such a great theme of this service, grace. God's grace. God sent a fish and swallowed him. But you know, probably not a real comfortable situation to be in. It's better than being dead, but it's still a little bit uncomfortable. But yet it was there that he found God. Again, he found God. They made peace. And the last verse of chapter 2 says the fish vomited him onto the beach. Well, that may not sound like grace, but compared to drowning, it's grace. And then we come to chapter 3. We come to chapter 3 of Jonah, and that's where we're going to be today. We're going to read the whole chapter. It's only 10 verses, but we're going to read Jonah 3 and see where this story takes us. And I want to encourage you, if you have not heard the first 2 messages in this story, go to our website and listen to weeks 1 and 2. Absolutely brilliant. So let's read Jonah 3. Then the Lord spoke to Jonah a second time. Get up and go to the great city of Nineveh and deliver the message I have given you. This time Jonah obeyed the Lord's command and went to Nineveh, a city so large that it took 3 days to see it all. On the day Jonah entered the city, he shouted to the crowds, 40 days from now, Nineveh will be destroyed. The people of Nineveh believed God's message, and from the greatest to the least, they declared a fast and put on burlap to show their sorrow. When the king of Nineveh heard what Jonah was saying, he stepped down from his throne, took off his royal robes, and dressed himself in burlap and sat on a heap of ashes. Then the king said to his nobles, the king and his nobles sent this decree throughout the city: no one, not even the animals from your herds and flocks, may eat or drink anything at all. People and animals alike must wear garments of mourning, and everyone must pray earnestly to God. They must turn from their evil ways and stop all their violence. Who can tell? Perhaps even yet, God will change his mind and hold back his fierce anger from destroying us. When God saw that what they had done and how they had put a stop to their evil ways, he changed his mind and did not carry out the destruction he had threatened. Now, I love the fact that Jonah is in the Bible. I like the other Old Testament prophets. I love reading Isaiah. Isaiah is amazing. Messianic prophecies about the end of the world. It's a great book. But I have a little trouble relating to Isaiah the prophet himself. In chapter 6 it says, in the year that King Uzziah died, Isaiah says, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, seated on his throne, and the angels stood above him. That didn't look like my prayer life this week. Did not see the Lord. So I have a little trouble relating to Isaiah as a man. Ezekiel. Man, I love Ezekiel. That's some crazy stuff in Ezekiel. In the very first chapter, it says, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. Well, that didn't look like my prayer life this week either. He saw visions of God. There was lightning and thunder and angels and creatures with four faces and these tire like gyroscope things. I mean, on the History Channel, they think they were UFOs. I don't know. Crazy stuff. But I have trouble relating to that guy. Daniel, man, who cannot like Daniel? He stood up to an unjust law that said, if you pray, we're going to throw you to the lions. And he did it anyway, and God protected him. But it's also Daniel who said, I saw the Ancient of Days seated on his throne. I saw one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds of glory. Daniel had a conversation with Gabriel, the archangel. He talked to angels. I have trouble meeting new people on Sunday morning. And he's talking to angels. But when I get to Jonah, here's a guy I can relate to. Here's a guy I can go, okay, I've been there and done that. God says, I want you to go. And I go, nope, not going to do it. God says, you need to change. Oh, no, God, nope, don't want to change. Don't use the C word with me. Change is hard. Nope. God says, you need to start giving more. I'm not listening. I can't hear you. Anybody ever been there? I can relate to Jonah. But you know, then we're surprised when the storm comes. Because when we say no, it triggers storms. Let me give you a life lesson. If you don't get anything else today, this will help you. You can never say no to God without consequences. We can never tell God no and not expect consequences. Now, they'll come in different ways. They may not come right then, but trust me, there are consequences for telling God no. And that's what happened to Jonah. The consequences were the great storm. And the great storms come in our life. And then we go, oh, you were serious. You really do want me to change. Okay. And so Jonah makes his peace with God. And then we come back, we'll just go throw chapter 3, verse 1 on the board again. It says, then God spoke to Jonah a second time. This is one of my favorite verses in the entire Bible. God spoke to Jonah a second time. A second time. He didn't give up on him on his first disobedience. He said, Jonah, no, we're still working here. You know, when we talk about consequences, sometimes we think that it's different. But you know, when we're parents, it's the same kind of thing. We raise our children and we want them to understand that disobedience, bad choices has consequences. And God's a good dad. He's a good father. Just as our children, if we let them get away with doing whatever they want, if we let them get away with telling us no all the time, if we let them get away with constantly disobeying, what are we doing? Well, we're creating monsters, right? We're not creating adults, we're creating monsters. And so it's the same with God. He understands that He loves us. He's not telling us, He's not sending the storm because He's angry at us. He's sending the storm because He's a good dad. And He's wanting to help us get this lesson down. You know, sometimes when we think of grace as just a New Testament concept. But you know, grace is actually who God is. Grace is not just a New Testament concept. It's the nature of God. You can find grace on almost every page of the entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. And this story is such a great example of what God's grace looks like. Coming to a man who's thumbed his nose at God and then giving him a second chance. God spoke a second time. He spoke a second time. Now, what I want to do now, I'm going to just take us through, I'm going to give us 3 points. And just kind of the theme that I'm working with here as we work through this chapter a little bit is this idea that an imperfect prophet shared an imperfect message with an imperfect group of people with spectacular results. An imperfect prophet sharing an imperfect message with an imperfect group of people with spectacular results. Now let's talk about the imperfect prophet. You know, what I love about this is God didn't say, okay, Jonah, listen, you let me down. Now we're going to have to put you on double secret probation for a while and let you work things out and you get your issues sorted out and you know, you go to some counseling and you go to some therapy and we're just going to help you. No. Jonah, go. Again. God's message didn't change. Jonah, second time. Do what I told you to do. An imperfect prophet. God used an imperfect man to accomplish His purpose. He didn't say, Jonah, listen, you got to work everything out and then I'll use you. And how powerful is that for us? Because God doesn't say, you guys have got to get your act together if you think I'm going to use you. You know, the verse Pastor Joe used in communion, I've got it in my notes, Romans 5:8. God showed His love to us while we were still sinners. Christ died for us. He didn't say, okay, listen, you clean your act up, and then maybe I'll think about sending Jesus. No. While you're a sinner, while you're messed up. But you know, sometimes it can be kind of uncomfortable. Well, you know, I got to kind of earn this thing. I got to kind of work my way to God. How many times have you heard people say, well, look, I know I need to be in church, but let me get my issues dealt with. Let me deal with my problems. Let me deal with my stuff, and then I'll come to church. You know, we just launched Connect groups. I've had people say, you know, look, I got problems. Man, I'm just messed up. I can't go to Connect group. Those people, they got it all together. You know, if I go to Connect group, man, they're going to know that I got issues. Join the club. Welcome to the human race. We are all imperfect people going on a journey. And just go ahead and embrace it. Just embrace it. Because, you know, God's going to keep working in you. He's promised to keep working in you. But it's going to be the other side of eternity before we step into perfection. Right now, it delights God to use imperfect people. And this is another important thing here. God doesn't use perfect people. Jesus was the only one. The rest of us, we don't have a chance for that. So God's, you know, the pool's kind of small. It's just humanity. So you know, listen, it's not about perfection. But what it is about is obedience. Obedience is the key to kingdom living. In Jonah 3:3, it says this. It says, this time Jonah obeyed the Lord's command and went to Nineveh. This time he obeyed. And then that's where the breakthrough comes. You know, there is something powerful about the man or woman who just says, I'll go. There's something powerful about the man or woman who says, God, I don't understand what you're asking me to do. This is uncomfortable. This is hard, but I'll go. I'll do it. Heaven and earth move to support you when you say yes. God's angels are in motion. God's sending angels and the Holy Spirit in power when you say yes. The power of obedience. Did you notice I didn't say maturity? I didn't say, you've been a Christian for 20 years. Listen, the person who's been a Christian for 5 minutes can accomplish more than somebody who's been a Christian for 20 years if they'll just say yes. Just say yes. He'll use us. It's not perfection, it's just obedience. And then we've got an imperfect message. Listen to Jonah's message. Listen to Jonah's message. This is chapter 3, verse 4. He says, 40 days from now, Nineveh will be destroyed. What a terrible sermon. It's a terrible sermon. There's no Bible. There's no worship songs. There's no offering. What kind of church service is this? In 40 days, you're going to be destroyed. And then he turns around and walks away. What is that? And yet, God used that imperfect message to change a city. He used an imperfect message to transform an entire city of 120,000 people. Is that crazy? A terrible message, and yet somehow God used him. And Jesus has called you, and he's called I to take his message to the world. Did you know that that's not optional? If you're a follower of Jesus, you can't say, well, okay, I'll go to church, I'll serve once a month, I'll do it. But that whole thing of taking Jesus' love out there with lost people and people that are away from God and sinners, I don't know about that. We don't have an option. Jesus' last command, you will be my witnesses in all the world. I want you to go make disciples of all nations. So it's a non-negotiable. So what are we going to do with it? What's our message going to look like? What's our message going to look like? Well, but what if they ask me a question I don't know the answer to? I don't know that much Bible. I don't know my Bible that good. What if they had this argument that disproves the Bible or makes me look silly? Yeah. Most of those arguments are just smoke screens anyway. God doesn't expect you, and he doesn't expect me to have all the answers. He doesn't care if you've got all the answers. One of our good friends in Brazil, just a fantastic young guy, he's visited the church here a few times with his wife, Felipe and Cynthia, and just dynamite people. And they had been a part of C3 Church Curitiba for about a year. He had just come back to Christ, been away for a long time. And they were in our Connect group. Annie and I had an English-speaking Connect group at the church there, and we were just pouring into some key young couples. And after a year or so, I challenged Felipe. I said, listen, man, I think you need to be leading a Connect group. And he got this terrified look on his face. Yeah, I'm a new Christian. I've only been back in church a year. I don't know the Bible. What if they ask me questions? What if I don't know. What if they have problems I don't know how to solve? I said, calm down. Calm down. It's okay. It's okay. I said, here's our requirements. Let's just see if you meet these requirements. He said, okay. I said, do you love God? He says, well, yeah, I really do. I said, okay, that's one. Here's the next one. I said, do you love people? He says, we love people. We love helping people. We love serving people. I said, okay. I said, here's a third one. This one's optional. Do you know how to use Google? If you're that worried about them asking a question you don't got the answer to, use Google. But really, it's about loving God and loving people. And so they started leading a connect group. And they're just killing it. They're the young adult pastors now. But it started because he said, I'm scared to death, but okay, I'll do it. He didn't have a perfect message. But yet somehow God still used them to do is using them now to do incredible things. He just started preaching, every couple of months. A guy who was absolutely terrified to talk in front of people is now preaching every 2 or 3 months. Just because he said, I don't know what I'm doing, but okay. An imperfect message. Look, your message is never going to be perfect. Nobody has perfect theology, and you don't have to. Love God. Love people. I think sometimes when we're talking about the message, I think sometimes we have this idea that when we share God's love with people, we have to take them from A to Z in one conversation. I'm gonna start a conversation. I'm gonna start a spiritual conversation with this person, and before we're done, I've got to have them on their knees praying the sinner's prayer. You know what? It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way, and God doesn't expect. In our church here, you hear us all the time talk about just what's the next step. Let's just take a step. Let's maybe take 2 steps. Any football fans here? I love football, but reality is every drive doesn't end in a touchdown. Every drive doesn't end in a touchdown. If you watch a Super Bowl, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I didn't think anybody was going to score. But how awesome is it when a team puts one of those 8.5, 9-minute drives together, taking the ball down the field? And I'm not denigrating salvation, comparing it with a game, but it's a great analogy because this is life. We are helping people move down the field of life. And sometimes, they might only go a yard or 2. Sometimes we might help them get a few yards. But the goal is to get them to the goal line. And you don't have to know everything at every conversation. Just love people. Look for opportunities. The greatest message that you can share is your life. What's your story? What's God done for you? There's something powerful about sharing fresh things God's doing in your life. You don't have to be weird about it, but when you're talking to people that are non-church, there are plenty of opportunities to talk about what God's doing in your life and how He's changed you. Why is your marriage so good? Why are your kids turning out so good? Why are you getting blessed on so many ways? Man, there's just plenty of opportunities to share what God's doing in our life. So an imperfect prophet shares an imperfect message with an imperfect group of people. An imperfect group of people. The Nineveh was the capital of Assyria. Assyria, they were really bad people. They were really, really bad people. The Assyrians, if you look at history, they were considered one of the most brutal regimes in all of history. Violent, horrible, horrible atrocities committed by them during battle and as they conquered people. These were not good people. They were terrible people. And Jonah wanted them to get what they deserved. Have you ever felt that way? Man, that person, what they did to me, what they did to them, man, they don't deserve God's forgiveness. I hope they get what they deserve. We've all felt that way. Looking across the people in our lives who have hurt us, man, I hope God's judgment falls on them. Well, that was Jonah. That was the way Jonah felt. He hoped God's judgment would fall. In fact, he's probably the only preacher in history who preached this message hoping there would be no salvations. He preached this message hoping nobody was going to respond. I'm not even going to ask you to lift your hands. I'm just going to tell you God's judgment's going to fall and then I'm going to leave. And I hope you don't listen to me. All right? I mean, isn't that crazy? But I was obedient, God. I did what you said. But they were imperfect. They did not deserve God's grace. They did not deserve God's mercy, and they did not deserve God's forgiveness. But neither do I, and neither do you. But you know, they were really super bad. You know, God doesn't scale and doesn't compare like we do. There's a verse in the New Testament, Romans 3, it says, all have sinned and fall short of God's glory. He doesn't compare you to other people. He compares every single one of us to Jesus. That's the standard. Every one of us is compared to Jesus. So we all flunk. We all fail. An imperfect people. You know, God's called us to take our message to Nineveh as well. Well, who's Nineveh? Who's Nineveh for you? Timothy Keller wrote this book called The Prodigal Prophet. And this is actually the book that Pastor Jeff is drawing some of the material for this sermon series on. Brilliant book, The Prodigal Prophet by Timothy Keller. But one of the things he says in the book, he says this, he says, we're all called to go. Now, this might not mean going to another country, but it always means risk and vulnerability as we share God's love and our faith with others. Wow, it always involves risk and vulnerability. You have to be vulnerable to share your faith. You have to be vulnerable to start conversations. You have to be vulnerable to touch other people with God's love. It's not easy. And you know, some people look like they've got it all together. Wow, well, I'm sure they're fine. I'm sure they've got it all together. They don't really need God's love. They don't really need God's help. They're okay. There's another friend we have in Brazil at one of our other churches, a young lady named Fernanda. I was there a few years ago preaching and teaching, and one of the courses I was actually teaching, we were talking about spiritual gifts. And we were talking about how to take the spiritual gifts out of church into the world. I mean, we think spiritual gifts, when we read about them in the Bible, are just for church. But reality is, God gave those to you to use out there to help other people find full life in Jesus. And I was actually talking about, I said, listen, if you've got that person in your life, which we all do, people who don't know Jesus, people who are away from God, how are you going to reach them? How are you going to connect with them? What are you going to do to start a conversation with them? And so I said, listen, if you're not sure, I said, why don't you pray for them? Pray for them. Ask God to give you something to share with them. Ask for some supernatural insight. Ask for something to help you start a conversation. And our friend Fernanda, she said, she's a pretty new Christian herself, and she said, well, okay. There's a girl named Mariana that she worked with. And she said, you know what? I'm going to pray for Mariana. She doesn't know Jesus, and I'm going to pray for her. So she started praying for Mariana. She said, God, give me something. Give me an insight. Give me something, a word of knowledge or something that I can share your message with her. And while she was praying, she said this thought popped into her head. Just random thought popped into her head. Said, ask her about her husband. Well, that's kind of weird. What does that mean? But she said, okay. So they had lunch together that day, and they had never had a real spiritual conversation. But while they were having lunch, Fernanda said, Mariana, you know what? You've never told me about your husband. I'd love to hear about him. And she said this woman's face had this embarrassed and shocked look, and she started crying. And she just started sobbing there in the break room at their business. And Fernanda said, oh my God, what have I done? Oh, I'm so sorry. She said, I'm so sorry, Mariana. I didn't mean to make you cry. Please forgive me. I didn't mean it. And Mariana said, no, it's not your fault. You didn't know? But I just found out he's having an affair, and he said he wants a divorce. My life is in turmoil. My life is upside down, and I don't know what to do. And Fernanda said, she told me later, she said, I didn't know what to say. How do you say something to that? She said, but let me pray for you. She said, I'm a Christian and I'd love to pray for you. So she put her hand on her shoulder and she just prayed. She said, I didn't even know what to pray. She said, God, please let your love come upon Mariana. Let your peace come upon her. Let her feel your presence. And she said, the Holy Spirit fell in that break room. She said, we felt it. It was tangible. She said, Mariana looked up and her face was calm. She said, what just happened? She said, what just happened? I felt something that I've never felt before. And Fernanda said, listen, that was God. He just came in here and told you that He loves you and it's going to be okay. Now listen, I want you to come to church with me this Sunday. There's other people that want to help you go through this difficult time that you're going through. And so she started going to church, one of our C3 churches in Brazil. Now, I don't know what the end result was. I don't know. I got no idea what happened. But here's what I do know, that in that moment, the Holy Spirit fell and touched this young woman's life. And she will never forget that again. The power of connecting. And so what we got is, as we get ready to wrap up, Fernanda, obviously an imperfect person, shared an imperfect message with an imperfect woman. But Fernanda's obedience led this person to a relationship, a connection with a perfect God. Amen. Let's bow our heads. Let's pray.